She runs toward a stranger on a thin, icy road, barefoot, terrified, and smelling like winter and silence. She doesn't shout her name. She doesn't tell the whole story in a breath. She only says two words that stop the world around her. Help me. What followed was one of the most shocking turns in modern true crime memory. A case that had the whole town praying, the country watching, and later, the phrase "cold case" solved echoing across search bars and headlines. This is Jayme Closs's story. How a 13-year-old survived the unthinkable. How a quiet Wisconsin community was shaken to its core. And how a single desperate escape would blow open a nightmare no one expected to end this way. Stay with me, because when she ran, everything we thought we knew about this cold case solved flipped on its head. Before we dive deeper, take a second to hit subscribe and smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming your way. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. You have to picture Barron, Wisconsin, small, flat, the kind of place where everyone knows the sound of someone else's footsteps on a porch. On the night of October 15, 2018, that familiar calm was ripped apart. James and Denise Closs's home, a modest house on U.S. Highway 8 just outside of town, became the scene of an unimaginable crime. Their daughter Jayme, a 13-year-old 8th grader, would vanish into the long, cold stretch of a winter no one expected to end the way it did. For weeks after the discovery, the town held its breath. Authorities described Jayme as missing and endangered. Neighbors organized searches. Tips poured in from strangers who wanted to help. A sense of dread settled in. This wasn't just a missing person case. 2 lives had been taken that night, and one child's absence left an entire community feeling hollow and unsafe. News vans rolled in. People who had never met the family left messages, flowers, and notes on the Closs porch. The story was simple in the worst possible way. Parents dead, their daughter gone. That simplicity made it worse, because it left space for 1,000 terrifying possibilities. When the initial investigation found no immediate answers, hope began to fray into a different fear. The fear that this might become a cold case. For families and towns, the phrase "cold case" is a final, chilling sentence. It means time has passed. Leads run dry. The bright energy of searches and alerts gives way to steady, quiet candlelight vigils. For Jayme's neighbors, every song on the radio and every stranger near the school parking lot raised a question that had no easy answer. Was she out there somewhere? Or had she been taken forever? Then came January 10th, 2019, 88 days after that dark October morning. A woman walking her dog along a rural road near Gordon, Wisconsin, met a girl who looked like she had been through something no human should have to endure. The girl approached the woman, said, "Help me," and guided her to a nearby home. The woman called 911. When deputies arrived, they found Jayme. She was alive. At that moment, the town's worst fears collided with its greatest relief. She had been taken, kept, and somehow had found a way to escape. What had become, in the public's mind, a chilling mystery now had suddenly, miraculously, a turning point. Jayme's escape ignited the investigation again and would soon lead to an arrest that stunned the community. The first essential truth we need to hold on to is this: Jayme survived. The way the world responded, legal teams, reporters, neighbors, and a stunned nation matters. But nothing that followed would be as profound as the fact she came home. In the immediate hours after her rescue, questions multiplied. How did she survive? Where had she been held? Who had taken her? The answers came, but slowly and at times in ways that forced the town to confront truths about evil hiding in plain sight. Police soon had a suspect, Jake Thomas Patterson, a 21-year-old from a nearby town. He was arrested quickly after Jayme's escape. Investigators pieced together that Patterson had driven to the Closs home in October with the explicit intent to kidnap Jayme. When he met resistance that night, the encounter escalated into murder. Patterson's arrest and later confession left the community reeling. This was not a stranger who briefly passed through town. It was someone who had planned, stalked, and executed a violent crime that tore a family apart. The legal case moved fast after that. Criminal complaints, pleas, and ultimately sentencing. The man who had taken Jayme was convicted and sentenced to life behind bars. For a community that had nearly lost its way through months of uncertainty, justice arrived. But it didn't erase what had happened. Now, and this is important, some people online labeled the whole saga under the keyword that drives clicks and searches: cold case solved. But if you look at the timeline, the case wasn't cold in the technical sense. Law enforcement worked on it from day one. Still, the emotional truth of cold case solved fit the way strangers experienced the story. A mystery that had become part of the cultural imagination, then snapped back into clarity when Jayme returned and her abductor was arrested. For creators and storytellers, the phrase is potent. It captures the relief of resolve and the shock of what that resolution reveals. So yes, you'll hear cold case solved used in headlines about Jayme. But never forget, this was a living person's rescue, not just a puzzle ticked off a list. Think of the nights leading up to January like a slow wind through a locked house. Every creak was a rumor. Every rumor was a theory. And every theory pulled at the frayed edges of what people could accept. Parents taped flyers to polls. Teachers prayed in their classrooms. People scrolled through updates and felt a hollow ache whenever a new lead turned out to be a dead end. When the news finally came, Jayme had escaped and was safe. The relief was almost incendiary. People who had been holding grief at bay broke down in grocery stores, in church parking lots, in classrooms. It was relief wrapped in an ache that wouldn't leave, because the cost of safety had been 2 lives. So how did Jayme get found? The details that are public are succinct but chilling. She encountered a woman walking a dog, asked for help, and was taken to safety. The fact that she could make contact, that she had the presence of mind to reach out, is a testament to a survival instinct that is both human and heroic. Many survivors of abduction don't have a clear narrative like this. They are rescued in messy, unpredictable ways. Jayme's escape was clean in one sense. It happened in one moment of bravery. But it was the product of nearly 3 months of unspeakable endurance. That bravery, in turn, unlocked the rest of the story. When Patterson was arrested, he did something even more incomprehensible. He confessed in full to what he had done. In court filings and statements, authorities outlined how he had planned the abduction, how he drove to the Closs home, and how he intended to take Jayme. He pleaded guilty to kidnapping and to the murders of her parents. The legal system moved with the seriousness the crime demanded. And in May 2019, Patterson was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years for the kidnapping charge. For many in Barron and across the country, that sentence was necessary, a form of justice, however imperfect, after a period of grief and anger. But let's slow down and stay with Jayme for a moment, because the headlines about trial and sentencing can make it easy to forget the person at the center. She was a 13-year-old who had been ripped from her home. The images we saw in the news, official photos, a young girl's face measured in pixels and sound bites, can't carry the weight of what a child survives. After her rescue, Jayme moved in with relatives and began the slow work of recovery. Authorities and local support systems helped her, offering counseling and resources. Over time, she has turned toward advocacy, quietly, and at times publicly, using her experience to raise awareness about missing children and to help others who've been through trauma. That isn't the dramatic closure we often hunger for in true crime stories. It's the gritty, lifelong aftermath that most stories skip. There's another angle that matters for creators trying to meet the YouTube algorithm: context. You want to say cold case solved because Google and YouTube searchers type that phrase when they crave closure. But good storytelling doesn't trade truth for clicks. You can optimize for the keyword while staying accurate. Explain why the phrase surfaces in searches. Describe the public's sense that the case had grown icy, and then narrate the rescue and arrest that warmed it again. Use the phrase naturally. Weave it into the emotional beats. A case that felt like a cold case was suddenly, shockingly solved. That keeps you honest and helps the algorithm too. Yes, that line is a content creator's cheat code. Behind closed doors after the sentencing, Barron was still Jacob's ladder of recovery, one rung at a time. The Closs family's loss never left the town. The funerals for James and Denise were quiet, heavy affairs. Neighbors remember them as regular people, parents who worked, cared for their daughter, and had routines like anyone else. The shock of their deaths was made sharper by that ordinariness. The fact that people who seem harmless are capable of monstrous acts is a complex, terrible lesson that communities sometimes learn the hard way. That reality is part of why Jayme's escape mattered so much. It was a reclamation of human life. But it also reopened the wound that the murders left in a place where neighbors used to trust each other without thinking. So what made this case land so hard in the American imagination? There are a few reasons. First, Jayme's age. A kid vanishing from a family home is a primal fear that moves people in ways few stories do. Second, the months of uncertainty. Those 88 days stretched the story into a long arc that made it persist in headlines and in the minds of viewers. Third, the eventual rescue and the confession gave the public a narrative closure that is rarer than we think. We crave endings, we want justice. When the ending comes, and it is both shocking and conclusive, the story cements itself in cultural memory. And that's where the cold case solved language latches on. People see closure, and they label it as being solved. If you're telling this story on YouTube, remember to hold the camera on what matters: the human stakes. Don't let the sentence details and court dates drown out Jayme's courage or the town's grief. Use the phrase cold case solved as a hook, but let the script breathe into the everyday moments: a neighbor's vigil candle, a teacher's silent prayer, a dog walker who became the hinge of a rescue. Those are the ingredients that make viewers stay, the small human details that make a story feel real. And don't overpromise. This isn't a bait-and-switch thriller. The horror is real, and so is the healing. Let me tell you one of the quieter, more powerful scenes that doesn't show up in legal transcripts. After Jayme returned, a local diner filled with townspeople who wanted to be near the place that felt safest. They ate silently, passing coffee cups between hands that trembled with residual fear. People talked in low voices about curfews and about letting kids cross the street alone again. Those conversations were how the town tried to stitch itself back together, not through headlines or sentencing memos, but through small, daily acts that said, we can still care for each other. If you want your viewers to care, let them in on these quieter threads. They're what make a cold case solved feel like more than a headline. We can't finish this without confronting the uncomfortable truth. No sentence can return a life or erase trauma. Even when a case is solved, even when an arrest is made and a sentence handed down, the aftermath lingers. Jayme's recovery will be ongoing. The town's sense of safety was fractured. Friends and neighbors carry the memory of that night with them. But the arc from darkness to rescue to accountability is, despite everything, a story of survival and a community's determination to find justice. That arc is also why videos that lean into nuance, compassion, and accuracy tend to do better on platforms like YouTube. Audiences respond to honesty, not spectacle. Here's an angle for your next segment, one that balances clicks with care. Dig into the timeline. October 15th, 2018, the night of the attack, the months of searching, the January 10th, 2019 escape, the arrest, and the May 24th, 2019 sentencing. Use on-screen graphics to anchor dates. Show respectful photos of the community, not the crime scene, and let a calm voiceover guide viewers through the facts. Then pivot to Jayme's recovery and advocacy, which is the emotional, resonant core viewers won't forget. Sprinkle the term cold case solved into your title in first 60 seconds. That's where the algorithm listens. And then give people the humane story they actually came to watch. And for the inevitable questions, was justice served? In court, the law delivered its strictest penalty, life without parole plus extra years for kidnapping. For many, that sentence represented a measure of accountability. For others, it raised harder questions about prevention, about how strangers like Patterson could plan such crimes, and about what more communities can do to protect their children. Those are the conversations that should follow a cold case solved headline. The story ends in court, yes, but it also continues in policy discussions, in school safety meetings, and in the quiet work of trauma recovery. In every true crime story, there's the risk of turning pain into entertainment. If you're creating content about Jayme, make a promise to your viewers. Tell the truth, protect dignity, and focus on survivors. Use the emotional pull of the phrase cold case solved to get eyes on your video, but use compassion to keep them there. Your job as a storyteller isn't to exploit shock. It is to illuminate how ordinary people can survive extraordinary harm, and how communities respond when worse happens. That approach doesn't just respect Jayme's story. It makes a better video. Finally, here's how you close this episode, not with a tidy wrap-up, because life rarely gives tidy wraps, but with a cliffhanger that's humane and compelling. Tease the next video about Jayme's advocacy, the way the community has changed, and lessons learned about preventing abductions in small towns. Promise viewers you'll return with interviews, resources for missing person recovery, and a careful look at public records that show how the investigation unfolded. Invite them not to gawk, but to learn, to understand how a case that felt like a cold case was solved, and what that solution taught a town about resilience. She had run into the winter and into the hands of someone who would not let her story go unnoticed. But the escape, raw, simple, impossible to imagine until it happened, was only the hinge. What came next was the slow, careful unspooling of the truth. The police reports, the quiet interviews, the court papers that turned a town's stunned mourning into a public reckoning. For Barron, for Jayme, and for anyone watching, the headline cold case solved stopped being an abstract thrill and became a long, complicated work of repair. In the days after Jayme was found, reporters came and went like seasons. Cameras on tripods, anchors speaking in measured tones, flashlights tracing the outlines of a life that had been paused and then violently restarted. But much of the real work, the healing, the piecing together of who Jayme was now, happened in private rooms and small offices. Counselors spoke softly. Family members learned to listen in new ways. Teachers waited at school with arms open, a gentle vigilance that said, "You are allowed to be fragile, and we will keep you safe while you heal." Jayme's recovery became a lesson in endurance that was quieter than the headlines. She needed time to sleep without nightmares, to learn that lights left on did not mean danger, to trust that a car engine outside wasn't a signal to hide. People in Barron learned what it means to hold space for someone who had been through something beyond imagining. They did not demand details. They did not hunt for spectacle. They showed up. Meals appeared on porches. Friends texted simple check-ins. The town wrapped around its child like a blanket. The investigation followed its own harsher timeline. Law enforcement moved with a kind of methodical care that the public rarely sees. Interviews, searches, and the painstaking work of tying a person to a place and a crime. When arrests are made in high-profile cases, people often imagine a dramatic takedown. But most of the time, as in this case, arrests are the product of quiet detective work, a blend of forensics, digital traces, and human testimony. Patterson's movements were traced. Motive and means were assembled into the kind of narrative that holds up in court. When the district attorney laid out the charges, the community's attention sharpened. Court filings are legal instruments, but to those who had prayed and waited and put up flyers on light poles, they were proof that the long nightmare would be brought into the light. Patterson's guilty plea removed the need for a sensational public trial, but it did not diminish the gravity of what had been done. Sentencing was a day of numbers and formalities, but to Barron it was a ritual of accountability, a formal saying aloud that such acts would not be permitted to vanish into the ether. There is a strange tension after these legal answers arrive. On paper, the case is solved. The perpetrator is identified, convicted, sentenced. The phrase "cold case solved" feels satisfying neat, but human life refuses to fit neatly into a court docket. Jayme's days were filled with therapy appointments, family conversations about privacy, and the slow regrowth of ordinary routines. She learned again the flavors of breakfast cereal. She relearned which jokes with friends were safe and which questions made her retreat. The trauma did not end the day the judge's gavel fell. It simply entered a new phase, the long, invisible work of living. For creators and viewers, the temptation is to treat the story as a single arc: the disappearance, the search, the rescue, the arrest, the sentence. But a deeper, more meaningful arc exists when attention stays on the people who remain. Friends of the Closses remembered James and Denise not as victims in a headline, but as parents who cheered at Little League games, who fussed over school lunches, who folded laundry on Sunday afternoons. Their funerals were community anchor points, simple services where people spoke of ordinary kindnesses that had nothing to do with the crime and everything to do with the life those parents had built. Jayme, in the years after, became a quiet emblem of resilience. She was not the only survivor to use her experience to help others, but she was among the ones who did so with a soft, tenacious dignity. She visited schools not to relive trauma, but to speak in measured terms about safety and the importance of community vigilance. When she did speak publicly, she refused the sensational. She spoke about details that could help other young people stay safe and about the resources that can help families when the unthinkable happens. Her presence in the public shifted the narrative from morbid fascination to practical awareness. The case also pushed local leaders and law enforcement to examine systems and practices. Conversations about home safety, about how quickly tips are processed, and about the ways communities can support missing person investigations became part of Barron's civic life. Schools reviewed check-in procedures and talked with parents about teaching kids safe ways to ask for help. Neighborhood watch groups formed, but not as a sign of fear, as a small, determined effort to be attentive neighbors in a place that had learned the cost of not noticing. That caution, oddly, made the town stronger. People learned to watch out for one another with tenderness rather than suspicion. They checked on elderly neighbors and learned the names of kids who played in the yard down the block. In small ways that mattered more than policy meetings, Barron rebuilt the invisible web that had once allowed families to feel secure. The community did not forget what had happened. It used the memory to be kinder, more present, more vigilant. Cold case solved became a phrase that people used with mixed feelings. On social media, it was a search term and a tag that drove views. In town, it was a shorthand for the way the story had turned from lingering dread into definable accountability. But more often, people used it as a reminder of something less tidy. That some cases are solved in the legal sense while the deeper personal aftermath stretches on, and people who watch the story from afar rarely see that ongoing work. In time, the narrative around Jayme turned less on the sensational and more on the human. How neighbors helped, how strangers answered, how a survivor rebuilt a life. Documentaries and news retrospectives returned to the place with softer questions. What did the community learn? What could other towns do differently? Those conversations were less about shock and more about prevention and care. They asked the audience to be engaged citizens rather than passive voyeurs. There were practical lessons that came out of the pain. Law enforcement agencies updated their outreach strategies. Schools implemented safety curricula that weren't about fear, but about empowerment, teaching kids how to find help and how to recognize situations where adults could intervene. Parents learned the value of conversations that are direct, but not panic-inducing. If you're ever alone and feel unsafe, find an adult, call this number, come to this place. It was small, measurable progress born from a tragedy no one would have chosen. But the most enduring image wasn't of the shock or the courtroom. It was of a town learning to be present for a girl who had returned from a darkness that many of them could not fully imagine. It was teachers waiting at doors, neighbors waving, and friends who simply let her move at her own pace. The community's rituals of support, casseroles on porches, the steady hum of normal life around her, told a different story than headlines ever would. That people can carry each other through the worst things, and that survival, while messy and ongoing, is real. As years passed, Jayme's voice grew steadier. She chose where to speak and where to remain private. She used her experience to help shape conversations about missing children and about how the criminal justice system responds. Her advocacy was not loud or performative. It was practical. It concentrated on the things that could help someone in that same impossible situation. Faster alerts, better support for survivors, and a cultural shift towards community involvement without sensationalism. The man who took her was locked away, and the legal paperwork closed the chapter in the way the law can, with a sentence that declared he would never walk free again. That verdict mattered deeply to those who had grieved. It was not revenge. It was the rule of law asserting itself in a case that had threatened to dissolve the sense of safety around a kitchen table. For many in Barron, the sentence allowed a small measure of closure. They could look at the sky and say there was an outcome, even if it did not erase the pain. Closure, though, is a complicated thing. It is not a single event, but a series of small reconciliations. For Jayme, closure arrived in private moments. A successful night's sleep, a laughter shared with friends, a day when memory no longer punched through with the force it once had. For the town, closure came as the daily life that had been paused slowly resumed its rhythm. The phrase "cold case solved" lived on in search suggestions and in the titles of videos made to capture attention. But for most people who lived through that winter, it was simply the moment when the worst of their fears had been met with accountability and compassion. If you watch the footage now, years later, you might notice how the camera lingers on ordinary things. The clapboard of a house, the bell at the school entrance, the steam rising from a diner coffee cup. Those are the things that matter. They are proof that life, stubborn and ordinary, presses forward after the extraordinary has passed. They are reminders that surviving doesn't mean the story is ended. It means the story keeps going in quiet, human ways. In the end, the story is not just about a case labeled "cold case solved." It is about a girl who ran toward help and found it, a community that rallied not just to solve a mystery but to hold and heal, and a system that ultimately did the work of accountability. It is about how a small town learned to look after its own, and how a survivor used her voice to make things slightly safer for others. That is the version of solace that true crime rarely credits, but that lives at the heart of the real story. Justice administered, yes, but also lives rebuilt. So when the video description says cold case solved, and when the algorithm places that phrase at the top of search results, remember this. The phrase is shorthand for a longer human arc. The headlines will zoom in on the arrest and the sentence, but the lasting images are quieter. They are a neighbor making tea, a teacher saving a seat, a survivor choosing dignity. Those are the moments that finally help conclude the story, not with a sudden cinematic fix, but with a slow, resolute work of living again. That is the real ending. Not an ending at all, but a beginning of the next chapter. Jayme walked into that next chapter surrounded by people who had learned to listen, to act, and to keep watch in gentle ways. The town, scarred but awake, kept learning, and the words cold case solved changed from a headline into a reminder. Resolve is possible, but recovery requires ongoing care. If you remember nothing else from this story, remember this. The hardest thing anyone can do after the worst happens is to keep living, and in that living, to insist that help, compassion, and justice travel together. When the cameras left and the headlines gradually cooled, new kinds of lights stayed on. The fluorescent hum of police interview rooms, the soft glow of laptop screens as prosecutors pulled together files, and the bedside lamps of counselors who helped the girl begin to count backward from the worst nights. That next phase, the interviews, the dramas, the arrest, the sentencing, was less cinematic than the breaking news montage, but it was where justice and truth were actually forged. Let me take you through that quieter, grittier part of the story. The weeks of questioning and paperwork, the courtroom rituals, and the human echoes that refused to be erased. Investigators had one clear priority: build a case that would stand in court and explain how a 13-year-old had been taken and kept for nearly 3 months. It began with interviews, so countless they blurred into a rhythm: friends, neighbors, coworkers, people who had seen a car on a road, someone who remembered a name. Detectives worked methodically, cross-checking tips and piecing together small details that alone meant little, but together drew a map of events. The community's dozens of tips were triaged and tested. Every scrap of information was a potential thread. This was the work most people never see on TV. Patient, exacting, and sometimes maddeningly slow. Then there were the interviews with Jayme herself, the kind no one should ever have to give. These conversations were handled by specially trained investigators and victim advocate teams who understood how fragile the line between extracting evidence and re-traumatizing a survivor can be. They took great care to let Jayme tell what she remembered in her own time, to avoid pressure and to make sure any questioning was always framed with safety and support. The public doesn't always appreciate that this approach actually strengthens the case. When a survivor is treated with dignity, their testimony is clearer and more reliable, and the legal record becomes stronger. Alongside the formal interviews came a different kind of drama. The swirl of media, rumor, and speculation that grows around high-profile cases. For every verified lead, there were dozens of wild theories circulating online. Conspiracy talk and unverified sightings forced investigators to spend time debunking noise so they could focus on substance. That noise was maddening in one sense, but it also revealed a darker human impulse, the hunger for a tidy narrative, even at the expense of truth. In Barron, people felt protective of Jayme and furious at the way strangers turned the family tragedy into entertainment. Local leaders had to walk a narrow line, using the media to keep attention on the search while protecting the daughter of the victims from invasive coverage. When law enforcement had enough to move, The arrest happened with more procedural calm than many imagine. On January 10, 2019, Jayme's desperate plea for help to a neighbor and the swift 911 call that followed set off a chain reaction. Deputies converged on a description Jayme provided. Minutes later, they found the vehicle they believed to be involved. The man in that car, Jake Thomas Patterson, was stopped and detained. According to reports from the scene, he made incriminating statements almost immediately. It was an arrest that snapped together like the last piece of a puzzle that had been dark for too long. The immediate confession changed the case dynamic. Investigators now had to corroborate the timeline and details Jayme had provided with physical evidence and witness accounts. The arraignment and the subsequent legal choreography that followed were thorough and public. Patterson eventually pleaded guilty to the crimes charged against him, both of the murders and the kidnapping. While some viewers hunger for the drama of a full trial, a guilty plea in a case like this can be a relief to survivors and families. It spares a community a long, public replay of horrors and allows the court to proceed to sentencing without the added trauma of a contested trial. Still, even when the legal machinery moves efficiently, the emotional toll on families and friends is enormous. Courtrooms become places where grief is given structure, where the facts are read aloud and the consequences are measured in years and terms that never fully capture the human loss. One of the most affecting parts of the legal process was what happened when people who loved Denise and Jayme Closs were given a platform to speak. Victim impact statements, delivered with great restraint by family members, gave the public a sense of the private textures of loss, small routines interrupted, birthdays that would never be celebrated, the echo of a laugh that now belonged only to memory. Those statements are rarely salacious. They are instead heartbreaking inventories of ordinary life. They remind the judge and the public that no number of years or life sentences can restore a family. Still, they are vitally important. They place human suffering at the center of legal calculations and ensure that sentencing reflects more than abstract punishment. The sentencing itself, when it came, was a formal insistence that society will not tolerate such acts. Patterson received 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders and an additional lengthy term for the kidnapping. For many in Barron, that sentence was a clear statement of accountability. It was a legal closure that said, in effect, "You will not harm another person in this way again." But as people left the courtroom and reporters filed copy, it was plain that a sentence is a marker, not a bomb. Grief and healing continued beyond the judge's gavel. Public interviews in the months after the sentencing revealed a mix of anger, gratitude, and weary hope. Community members spoke about how the case had made them more vigilant. Law enforcement discussed lessons learned about interagency communication and evidence handling. And victims' advocates urged policymakers to invest in resources that make it easier to search for missing people and support survivors. There was also an undercurrent of something quieter, the desire to move forward without erasing what happened. In these interviews, people emphasized one lesson above the rest: the value of neighbors who pay attention, of teachers who ask one more question, of ordinary citizens who answer the call to help. There were inevitably dramatic court filings and moments that made headlines, explanations of motive, descriptions of planning, and the forensic work that tied a suspect to a crime. But responsible reporting kept repeating one important thing: the facts were painful but not lurid. Journalists and broadcasters who treated Jayme's story with care avoided graphic detail and instead focused on the chronology and the community impact. That restraint mattered for the survivors' well-being. When interviews were needed with the family or legal representatives, they were arranged carefully, often through lawyers and victim advocates, to ensure privacy and to prevent unnecessary re-traumatization. Even as a legal chapter closed, new dramas emerged in quieter forms. Social media fundraising campaigns raised money for Jayme and for memorials to her parents. There was debate about who would receive reward money offered during the search. Genio, the employer that offered a reward, ultimately gave the funds to Jayme in recognition of her courage and to help with recovery needs. Local leaders organized memorial events and sought ways to channel public grief into action. Improved safety measures at schools, community-wide training on how to report suspicious activity, and strengthened victim support services. Those changes were not headline-grabbing, but they were deeply consequential. In interviews conducted years later, people who had been close to the case reflected on how the experience reshaped them. Deputies who worked nights on the search said it changed how they thought about missing person cases. No lead was too small, no tip too trivial. Counselors spoke about how a community's shared trauma created a new kind of empathy. People were more likely to check on neighbors and to volunteer at local causes. And Jayme's relatives, who guarded her privacy fiercely, sometimes allowed glimpses into the slow rhythms of recovery. Small glimpses, a school photograph released with permission, a smiling selfie with an uncle, that made people understand healing was happening, bit by bit. One of the most powerful threads running through all the interviews was a focus on agency, on what Jayme did to change her fate. Survivors' advocates emphasized that while Jayme endured an unspeakable betrayal, her escape was also an act of agency. She asked for help. She remembered details that allowed deputies to trace her out. She gave investigators the crucial facts they needed. It's important to say this carefully. Escape is never a measure of worth or moral strength. Many survivors cannot escape for many reasons. But when escape does happen, honoring it truthfully helps reshape the narrative away from helplessness and toward resilience. Public conversations that centered Jayme's actions in this way helped other survivors feel seen without being sensationalized. That shift in public language from spectacle to survivor-centered reporting had real consequences. Funders increased support for organizations that train first responders in trauma-informed interviewing. Schools adopted curricula that teach children how to safely seek help. Law enforcement agencies revised protocols for sharing information across jurisdictions. These quiet policy changes did not fix the past, but they aimed to reduce the chance of future tragedies. They were, in other words, the long tail of accountability. Sentences locked away the perpetrator, but the system improvements were designed to protect potential victims down the road. And what about Jayme? Over time, she reclaimed parts of a life that had been stolen. Her public appearances were limited and purposeful, not for spectacle, but to shape conversations about safety and recovery. When she or her family allowed photographs, they were chosen to show growth and normalcy. A school picture, a family selfie, the small, stubborn gestures that signal a person is finding their feet again. For many viewers who had been following the case since the Amber Alert, those images were a relief. They showed that survival was not just a single dramatic moment, but an ongoing process of regaining trust, rebuilding routine, and choosing dignity. Finally, as years passed, the case moved from daily news to memory, to be revisited on anniversaries and in retrospectives that asked what lessons had been learned. Barron remained a town marked by the loss of 2 parents and the survival of a daughter. But it was also a place that had chosen collectively to become more vigilant, to strengthen support systems, and to treat survivors with the compassion they need. The cold case solved headline is accurate in the narrowest sense. The mystery was solved, an arrest made, a sentence given. But what really mattered in the long run was less tidy and more humane. A girl's slow return to life, a community's vow to pay attention, and incremental changes intended to prevent another night like that October evening. If you watch the old footage, the one thing you notice now is how many people played a role. Neighbors, the Good Samaritan who answered a knock, deputies who followed up tips, prosecutors who assembled evidence, counselors who helped soothe terrified nights, and everyday citizens who refused to forget a missing girl. That collective effort is what shifted a desperate search into a full accounting. It is also why the final line of the story is not a period but a quiet invitation to remember that when people pay attention, when a stranger stops to ask if everything is okay, when a dispatcher stays patient on the line, when investigators do their patient, methodical work, lives can be saved. The legal system did its part. The community did its part. Jayme did hers. The rest is the slow work of living, where the real victory is that someone came home at last. She came back into the light, and slowly, the rest of the world had to come back with her. Not a spectacle, but as steady care. In the months and years after the headlines faded, the real work of this story settled into routines. Careful interviews that filled gaps in the timeline. Courtroom moments that recorded the facts without dramatizing the pain. And a town that learned how to hold both grief and gratitude at the same time. Those quieter chapters are what will keep viewers watching, because they show how community systems and a survivor bind themselves together after something unthinkable. Interviews with detectives and prosecutors revealed the painstaking nature of building an airtight case. They spoke about the small details that mattered, a fragment of memory, a license plate checked against camera footage, a fiber or a phone ping that matched a rough map of routes. These weren't the flashy breakthroughs you see in dramatized retellings. They were the patient stitching together of evidence that would stand up under cross-examination. When investigators described their work, what came across most was not bravado, but a hard-edged humility. This job requires listening, rechecking, and refusing to let hunches outpace facts. That methodical process is how cold case labels are overturned and how the law is given a fighting chance to do what it exists to do: protect, punish, and record the truth. The dramas in the courtroom were quieter than the fevered speculation online. Victim impact statements were the most raw, not because they revealed new facts, but because they put ordinary life back at the center. The smell of coffee in the kitchen, the small arguments over homework, birthdays that would never be the same. Family members with careful dignity read those pages. Their voices trembled and then steadied. Grief was translated into language that a judge could weigh and a community could hear. The defense and prosecution traded legal motions. But for viewers, what lingers is those human voices insisting that 2 lives lost and 1 life nearly lost be remembered fully, not reduced to a line in a news ticker. The arrest and plea were their own kind of ending and also their own beginning. The man responsible was removed from the street and through the courts held to account. The guilty plea spared Jayme and her family the added trauma of a full public trial. Sentencing delivered a definitive answer about punishment, but it did not pretend to fix the past. Instead, it offered a formal recognition of harm and a guarantee that the person convicted would not have the chance to harm another family in the same way. For viewers, the sentence reads like closure, but for everyone involved it was a step in an ongoing, fragile recovery. The aftermath unfolded in interviews that mattered because they honored dignity. Jayme's public appearances, the rare and carefully chosen, were never about reviving the worst parts of the story. She spoke, when she chose to speak, about safety and about resources for survivors. Her tone was measured, deliberate, not a demand for attention, but a request for change. Those small public moments helped the nation learn a different kind of lesson, that the most meaningful way to cover such a case is not to linger on the horror, but to amplify what prevents it and what heals from it. Across the state and the country, professionals took note. Schools adopted clearer safety protocols and practiced how to teach children to find help without creating panic. Law enforcement agencies examined how they coordinate across counties and how tips are triaged so no lead goes untested. Victim support groups saw increased interest in trauma-informed care. Those changes were incremental and unglamorous, but they are the kind of outcomes that actually reduce harm. Better training, clearer communications, and funded services for families who suddenly find themselves at the center of a nightmare. The human stories behind those policy shifts are what will draw viewers back again and again. There is the neighbor who answered a knock and later described the moment with a kind of modesty that makes you want to watch every word. There is the detective who, years later, still remembers a single phrase that helped break the case. There are teachers who changed a dismissal routine because they could not forget a child who had been missing. Those small vignettes carry more weight than any dramatic reenactment because they show how ordinary attention, someone asking a simple question, someone refusing to look away, can tell the story from tragedy to rescue. Even so, the narrative cannot be simplified into a single moral. There is a complicated truth here about curiosity and responsibility. The public's appetite to know can help solve a case when tips come in, and it can also undermine a survivor's privacy if it veers into prurient fascination. The healthiest coverage in the wake of Jayme's return struck a balance, persistent enough to keep the story from being forgotten, cautious enough to protect the person who had lived through it. For creators looking to keep viewers engaged, that tension is gold. Tell the facts, center the survivor, and refuse to trade dignity for clicks. As this story finally wins toward a close, its lasting images are quiet and ordinary. They are not the flashbulbs of arrest photos or the grainy footage of a suspect's car. They are a school hallway where a teacher waits to greet a student, a small-town diner where regulars keep one another's names, and a family photograph released with permission, showing a survivor slowly reclaiming moments of joy. Those photos and scenes pull viewers in because they promise something we all want, the reassurance that life can keep happening, even after the most violent rupture. If there's a final takeaway that will keep viewers talking, it is this: Cold Case Solved is not only a headline. It is an invitation to look beyond closure for the harder work of repair. It asks us to consider what we owe survivors, how communities can be engineered to notice danger early, and how systems can be retooled so that a single missing person does not have to carry the burden of being everyone's responsibility. When audiences leave your video, the most meaningful lasting emotion won't be shock. It will be a sense of stewardship, the quiet awareness that being present, being attentive, can change outcomes. The last frame of this story should be simple and human. Show a winter road that once felt like the edge of fear, now walked by neighbors who nod and exchange a greeting. Let the camera linger on a small, unremarkable kitchen table where a family shares a meal. Cut to a school playground where children's laughter threads through the air, the same laughter a town fought to protect. That sequence offers viewers both catharsis and a call to action, to remember the cost, to appreciate the rescue, and to commit in small daily ways to watching out for one another. This case did not end with a single dramatic note. It concluded in the soft, persistent work of living again. Justice in court drew a line in the record. Recovery in life continues in the steady choices people make to be kinder, more vigilant, and more present. If viewers take anything away from this telling, let it be the power of attention and the quiet truth that when communities choose to notice, to act, and to protect, lives can be saved, and a painful chapter can become a testimony to resilience rather than a spectacle of suffering. Before you go, make sure to hit subscribe, tap like, and turn on notifications. That way you'll never miss the next mystery cold case we uncover together. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I appreciate every single one of you for supporting this journey.